We now turn to part two of looking at Confucius's virtue theory. One thing that all virtue theorists have in common, again extending across time and space, is this notion of the mean. So Confucius puts forth the idea of equilibrium, and his claim is essentially this also goes into how Aristotle, will see when we talk about him, about the emotions and virtue and so forth. And for Confucius, the mind is in equilibrium when there are no stirrings of pleasure, anger, sorrow, or joy. However, that would be brought about. Harmony, of course, is when you have these feelings, but they are, as Confucius says, stirred and act in due degree. And virtue theorists are very much into the emotions and their role in, how people behave in terms of assessing whether something is virtuous or not. And we'll see this when we talk about Aristotle, the idea being to act in the right way towards the right people for the right reasons, in the right amount. And Aristotle focuses quite a bit, as Confucius does, on feelings. Having too much, anger, too much sorrow, too much joy, too much pleasure, etc., seen as being bad. And so virtue theorists aim towards the mean. This could also be translated, depending on how you look at it, in terms of like being harmony, being in this middle ground. And so if we combine equilibrium and harmony, at least according to Confucius, then this will result in a happy order, and this will be good for everything. Now, this is presented, as I mentioned, broadly in virtue theories. We've seen they pretty much all answer the question, hey, why should I be good? With the answer, hey, you'll be happy if you're virtuous. Being virtuous will make you happy. Then the question is, hey, how do I do this virtue thing? The answer is always you aim for the mean, the middle. And so the idea is that, as we'll see in much more detail in Aristotle, the idea is that the virtue is a mean between two extremes. One is too little, a deficiency. The other is too much, an excess. And the mean is just right. And I always use the comparison to the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. So Goldilocks does a little breaking and entering in the Three Bears' house. She finds their porridge. One is too hot, one is too cold, and one is just right. And so virtue theory is kind of a porridge theory of morality, where there's excessive, deficient, and just right. Virtue theorists also look at the challenge and question of how do you achieve this? And they typically note that this is a difficult thing, that people generally don't achieve the mean. In some cases, it's that people go beyond it. Some people don't come up to it. And the reason is that, it's difficult. As he says in kind of a metaphor or analogy, everyone eats and drinks, but few can distinguish flavors. And he notes, not explicitly, that it's difficult. He also presents examples of people who've, achieved this, such as Shun, who loved to question others and study their words, to conceal what was bad in them, display what is good, and explicitly lays out, again, the doctrine of the mean, to hold out the two extremes of people, the deficiencies, the excesses, and then determine the mean, and then employ that in government. And on one hand, we'll talk about the mean in context of Aristotle, but in a way, the mean is just tautologically, by just definition, the right thing, not too much, not too little. So kind of the question, you ask for, say, health, how much water should I drink, per day? And the answer obviously is not too much, not too little, but just right. But then the practical question is how much is that in terms of how much is just right in terms of ounces? And again, it's just obvious in a sense and true by definition that, what is in the middle, what is not too much, what is not too little, will be just right. But what is that? He also uses the example of Wei, which I'm probably mispronouncing, who made the choice of the mean, and when he got a hold of what is good, held on to that, to not let that go. So what are the various virtues? We've seen some in the previous video, and he includes many of the classic ones, like these will not be shocking. One is benevolence, which he considers to be a characteristic element of us humans, and the way you demonstrate this, the way you exercise it, is in loving relatives. There's also righteousness, in which if you follow that, your actions are right. And he says you do this by honoring the worthy. There's also for him, because he's very concerned about social order, the principle of propriety, which essentially addresses the question about, so what about people, that are distant from us? How should we handle that? And he notes, we have decreasing measures of love to relatives, the idea of like the more distant, but of course one can have greater love for a distant relative in terms of, liking them better than closer ones. But the idea sort of is like the more distant someone is, there would be decreasing love for them. And of course, the more distant someone is in terms of being worthy, you would have, the proper amount towards everyone. So how does one achieve this? Well, for him, you have to achieve this perfect virtue by cultivating the principles of your nature. Because again, he believes that by nature, people are inclined towards good. They can go bad, of course, obviously. And the idea is you have to develop them. And the idea is that you cultivate these principles of your nature, exercise them, and you'll, get on the path or get close to the path of this mean. And he brings forth once again what can be called the silver rule, which is what you do not like when done to yourself, do not do to others, which is generally fairly good advice in terms of, if I don't like it, I probably shouldn't be doing that to other people. Now, more virtues. So as I mentioned before, virtue theorists take duties to be generally coming from virtues. Like your virtue leads you to fulfill these duties. It's virtuous to fulfill them. And he has 5 duties of universal obligation. There's between the sovereign and the minister, between father and son, and the one reference to women, between husband and wife, elder brother and younger brother, and friend to friend. Although that could include women, perhaps. But there's no elder brother, younger sister, or elder sister, younger brother. Again, sexism. So he considers those to be these relationships, the 5 relationships. And the way these virtues are practiced, he says, are by knowledge, knowing things, magnanimity, which is kind of like generosity, but going beyond that. Also energy. And lastly, singleness. Now, there is the question again that virtue theorists look at, is the question of moral education. Aristotle says a lot about this, Jean-Jacques Rousseau as well, other philosophers too. And virtue theorists, of course, they're all about developing character, so they tend to focus very practically, how do you develop these virtues? So Confucius, not super helpful, because he says some people are born with the knowledge, some people know it through study, some people get it after painful fear of their ignorance. So basically, you might be born with it, you might get it through study, you might acquire it because you feel ignorant and decide to get it. But that, of course, doesn't really tell you how you can go about doing it. But he claims that once you acquire it, it's all the same knowledge. So it doesn't matter how you get it, it's all the same. Again, not a lot of advice about how to actually do this. He also says that people practice them, some very easily, naturally, others from a desire for their advantage. It's difficult for others, which is all kind of true about just about anything. Almost anything some people just seem naturally good at it, be it painting, running, investing or whatever. Some people do these things, for the advantages. In the case of like athletics, health, in the case of investing, obviously money. And some people, it's very difficult for them. This all seems true. But he claims once you achieve it, it's all the same thing. Now, somewhat the emperor of virtues is sincerity. And again, whenever we're translating between different languages, we always have to be careful to note that translations are, of course, not not perfect. And so if we take a term in a language and translate it to another, it doesn't always capture it. I mean, this is especially true in obviously like, sayings and slang terms, but even when we consider sort of like standard terms, don't always translate, perfectly. Different concepts. So it's translated often into English as sincerity, but then the question is, does it correspond to, exactly to sincerity and as is conceived in English? So for him, what is sincerity? Well, it's all kinds of good and important qualities. It brings about self-completion. It's a way by which you must direct yourself. It is the end and beginning of things. And without it, he claims there would be nothing. And the superior man, again, translation would be sort of like the wise person, perhaps, regards this attainment as the most excellent thing. So sincerity, super important. He also claims that sincerity is the way of heaven, not, because he's writing, way before Christianity. He doesn't mean like the Christian heaven. This is a translation using an English term heaven. So not the conception of heaven, which you would have in, say, Christianity, various versions developed later. And then, in this metaphysics, there's like heaven and earth. Basically, earth is where we are, and heaven is like somewhere else, essentially. Just like with all metaphysics, difficult. So if sincerity is the way of heaven, attainment of sincerity, he claims, is the way of, men, of us humans. So how do you acquire it? He gives, again, not like a super detailed guide. Essentially, here's how you do it. Studying what is good, having inquiry that is accurate, reflect carefully, and have clear discrimination. Not discrimination in the sense of being sexist or racist, but discrimination in the sense of being able to like distinguish. So a person might have like excellent discrimination about, say, music. They can pick out, they can distinguish the notes, the sounds very effectively. They're not like racist against music, hopefully, but they can distinguish things. So we often think today of discrimination as like a bad thing. But, neutrally, it just means being able to distinguish between things. You make these very fine distinctions between them. And of course, lastly, earnest practice. So if you get intelligence from sincerity, he claims that's due to nature. So presumably by nature, people who are sincere get intelligence. Sincerity resulting from intelligence is due to instruction. So this provides us with some clues to how you develop the sincerity. It might be that nature, or as they say, nurture. But it does say that given sincerity, there shall be intelligence, and given intelligence, there shall be sincerity. In terms of exactly what that means, one does not know, essentially. One can have various theories, of course. So having sincerity is supposed to be really important. So what does it do for you? Because it's always fair to ask for moral theory, what's in it for me? So it seems to do quite a bit, that if you have sincerity, you will hit without effort what is right, you'll apprehend without the exercise of thought, basically just understand things, and you will naturally and easily embody the right way. Basically that it seems to be saying, so use kind of modern slang, that if you have sincerity, that it'll be kind of easy mode, that you'll be able to do what is right without effort. You will understand things without having to like really put, needless work into it, and being right will be easy. Now, Aristotle goes into some of this similarly, his idea being that, first it's very hard to become virtuous, but eventually it becomes like a habit. It becomes natural and, kind of easy. And you could look at this being similar to, say, sports or drawing or anything that requires, skill and effort. That at first, if you're first learning how to, draw, or you just decide, hey, I'm going to go out for, track or cross country or something, or I'm going to run a 5K or a marathon. At first, going from, say, couch to running is very difficult. But eventually it becomes, easier. The more you do it, the easier it becomes. And so this seems to be what virtue theorists generally talk about, that once you achieve this state, then things become much easier. It also has other wonderful, effects according to Confucius, such as once you possess it, it's not merely your self-completion, but you help complete other people and things also. That by completing yourself, you show your virtue. By completing others, you show your knowledge. And he believes this is the way by which, union is affected of the external, what's outside, and internal, of course, what's inside. And whenever a person who's completely sincere, again, it's not like, signing a letter sincerely yours, it means something like genuine, etc. Then what Confucius claims is that if you're acting from complete sincerity, this special, state of virtue, your action will be right. I mean, again, one could kind of use, Aristotle often uses an analogy to other activities. One could say like with the sports, like when you achieve like the state of athletic excellence, then you'll generally do things, the sports things, right or well. Doesn't mean you always win, but you'll do well. Now, the person who develops these qualities becomes what's known as the superior man, or the wise person, or the sage, or the good person. Again, it's all problems with translations, the exact wording. So a person who's this wise person embodies the mean. And probably a intentionally pun of translation is that the mean, the superior man embodies the course of the mean. The mean man, like being mean like in a meanie, the mean man acts contrary to the course of the mean, capital N. So the superior person, the wise person, embodies the course of the mean because they are the wise person and they maintain the mean. So the way you tell if someone's wise and virtuous is you look at their actions, and if they're always, hitting that mean, not excess and not deficiency, you'd say, aha, they're virtuous and wise. And the mean man, they act contrary to the course of the mean because they are mean and have no caution. So the wise person, the superior person, honors their virtuous nature. Also, one thing that Confucius was really big on is knowledge and study, inquiry and study. And so he links, and Aristotle does this as well, that it's not just being virtuous, it's not just like being good and having the right feelings. It also requires knowledge. So goodness is a matter of both feeling and intellect. So a superior person, the wise person, keeps, learning things. Also is not content to simply rest on old knowledge, but is continually acquiring new knowledge. And so knowledge, quite important. And as Confucius sees it, the person is earnest in their practices. Other qualities of the superior person, according to Confucius, what they do, and something we saw earlier, is this, that they are willing to admit their mistakes. So in the US, probably other places as well, we have the saying, it is a poor, craftsperson who blames their tools. And what Confucius uses is an analogy to an archer, that he says archery is like the way of superior or the wise person. If a good archer misses their target, they don't blame, the target. They don't blame their bow or arrows. They look for the cause of failure in themselves. I mean, obviously, like the bow or arrow could be defective, but the idea being, since it's a metaphorical lesson and not a realistic analysis, the idea essentially is that if one makes a mistake, then one should not be going around blaming others, but look for the cause of failure in themselves. Now, again, today, this is something we, on one hand, we're supposed to do. Like people generally say things like you should admit your mistakes, and it takes a big person to admit their mistake and correct it. But of course, admitting mistakes is often taken as a sign of weakness and uncertainty and punished in terms of, except of course when people do these, apologies where they generally don't take responsibility. They apologize by blaming others. But interesting question in ethics about accountability and ethics. He also divides up the energies into the southern energy and northern energy. So kind of a bit of metaphysics. So the energy of the South is forbearance and gentleness, not to revenge unreasonable conduct, and this is the study of the good person. The northern energy of the northern regions is to lie under arms and meet death without regret. So basically, fighting and stuff. And this is studied by the forceful. What about the superior person, the wise person? Well, they have a friendly harmony, but they're not weak. They stand in the middle without inclining to either side, as to say, the mean, not excess, not deficient. When good principles prevail in the wise person's country, they remain the same. When bad principles prevail, they also, even when death threatens, they remain the same. Which, of course, does raise the usual moral questions. If things are going badly in one's country, does one just simply go along with that, setting aside and sacrificing their professed principles and values for success or even just safety? Or does one, stick to those principles even in the face of, harm, punishment, or even death? And of course, practical people will often say, what matters is success. And so definitely sell out. So that brings us to the end of a quick look at Confucius, virtue theorist. So he's got the mean between two extremes as the goal. And as we saw, doesn't provide, all these argument after argument backing this up. That's something that's done by our good dead friend Aristotle, who's also a virtue theorist, although also dead. And he has arguments for everything, because student of Plato, who was, learned from Socrates, who argues everything. So stay safe, stay virtuous, and I'll see you in the future.